Welcome, StarCraft community, to Improved Analysis, Episode 4 with Dedzerg. And today we're going to be talking about spotting macro inconsistency. So things like missing probes, missing production cycles, not spending your larva in an efficient way. Those are all the hallmarks of good macro plays. Consistent probe production, high drone count as soon as possible, not missing production cycles on your barracks. Things like that. That's going to give you that unit lead when the big fight comes. So there's some specific areas to focus on in the game, in the UI when we're looking at a replay, that will give you hints as to whether your macro is actually slipping or if it's not slipping. So those areas are, one, the production tab. You always want to be looking at the production tab if you're a Terran or a Protoss, because you want to see, are there constantly SCVs or probes in production? Are there constantly units in production on the production facilities like a gateway, a robo, or a Stargate, barracks, factory, or starport? Are there constantly units being produced out of those buildings? Next place you may want to look if you're a Zerg player is the Units tab. How many larvae am I currently floating? Am I floating 8 larvae? Am I floating 0 larvae? You want to be floating as few larvae at all times as possible. That means you have the most possible units on the battlefield at all times. And then the final thing that you want to look at is the little selection box and see, are my gateways on cooldown? Are my gateways off cooldown? You want gateways to always be on cooldown, and you want things like barracks to have units queued. So let's go in and talk about these things in a couple of example replays. We're going to look at them specifically to identify areas when the macro slips, and then talk about why did that macro slip? What's the reasoning behind that mistake? And how can we correct that moving forward in games, future ladder games, future tournament games? Alright, so here we are, game number 1. It's going to be a Terran versus Protoss to talk about specifically using the production tab and the selection bar. We want to always have a probe or an SCV in production. There are a couple exceptions, which I'll talk about, but we pretty much always want to have one of those in production. The two exceptions are, maybe you're building a mothership core, so you're down to 1 probe instead of 2 on production, or 0 instead of 1. And the other exception is, are you constructing an orbital command? So we'll see, and there's very typical points in the game when those two sort of macro inconsistencies pop up, but they're normal, they're supposed to happen, obviously. So here, let's start watching this replay. We're going to watch at 2 times speed, or 4 times speed, just to speed things up and watch. And we want to make sure, is there always something in production? The early game is a little bit different because sometimes we're going to cut just to make our build that much more efficient. But once we get a little bit further into the game, once the second nexus is down, those kind of things, we want to see fairly consistent production the entire time. And so we're seeing that if we look at the probes, we can see that there's pretty much always a probe in production. And then we're going to go up to 2 probes in production when the nexus finishes, which is great. That's exactly what we want. There we go. 2 probes start. Now we drop back down to 1, so we might say, oh, was there a mistake there in macro? But no, the mothership core is being produced, so everything is looking fine at this point. If we continue along, we are eventually going to see small slip-ups in macro. So here everything's good, but there, for one moment, this probe count dropped down to 1 and then up to 2. So there was maybe 1 second or 2 seconds there where the Protoss player was actually getting behind on probe production. He was missing a probe. That's just wasted time that could never be a probe. That probe could be 2 seconds faster, could be mining 2 seconds faster. So we might look at that. In this case, I would say it's just a small mistake. There was enough money up here to produce the probe, but the probe wasn't produced quite on time. So just a simple error of execution. As we go on, though, we're going to see that the Terran player decides, now we're watching the minimap, to do a little attack. And when this attack comes out and reaches here, we're going to notice that probe production ceases completely. So right here, he's coming in, and we can see on the mini-map that the Protoss player is fighting against the Terran player. And here, probes drop completely off the production tab. So right now, the Protoss player is floating 500 minerals and isn't producing probes. So there's clearly an error here in execution when under some kind of stressful situation, like micro, the player is forgetting to make probes. So how can we fix this? So that's the reasoning behind the mistake. So we have to identify that. The resource tab and the minimap are our tools to do that. Oh, there's a little engagement. He's not supply capped and he's not making probes. So the reasoning there is, well, he's just focusing too much on the micro and not taking time for half a second just to queue a couple probes during the battle. Another reason might be, and we look up here to see that, oh, he's actually supply capped, so I need to figure out a better timing to build a pylon in order to avoid that supply cap. As we can see here, the Terran player is supply capped. But his depots are about to finish, his production cycle is midway, so he's actually okay. So that's the first thing. So we want to identify the mistake. It occurred here. What's the reason that that mistake occurred? And then the final thing is, how do we have a correction for this? So I missed probes during this initial attack when the Terran pushes. I missed probes. So what I need to say to myself is when I see an attack, remember, build probes. And then while I'm microing, just say, build probes. And so that can be something that's fairly difficult to work into your play because you have to be very aware during a fight. But that's going to be what corrects it. Using a fight every time you see a fight to trigger the response, I need to macro now, instead of using the fight to tunnel vision on the micro. So there's our first example. That's how to watch workers for both Terran and Protoss. As Zerg, you can use this technique of watching the production tab and making sure there's consistent production. If you're looking to consistently produce queens for some reason, like you're playing against Air Toss or you're playing against Mass Phoenix, something like that. That's a good way to check if your production has been consistent in those situations. So now we're going to jump over to a Protoss versus Zerg game, and we're going to look at a couple other tools. So the units tab and then the selection bar. All right, welcome back. So here we go. We're in a Protoss versus Zerg now. And what we want to watch in the units tab for Zerg is he consistently spending his larva? So right now we see 2 larvae, 3 larvae, 5 larvae, 6 larvae, 8 larvae. At this point, he's floating too much larva and isn't spending them on useful things. So at this moment it is, why is he floating larva? That's always a good question to ask. Did he do too many injects, and could have he got a creep tumor instead because there's just not enough money to support it? Which in this case looks like is the situation. There just simply isn't enough money to support producing producing drones this entire time. So perhaps squeezing in a creep tumor would be good. Or looking at your build and saying, did I perhaps take this third base slightly too fast? Did I leave workers on gas too long? Those kind of things are going to be really helpful to determine, can I get some more minerals to spend all this larva that I have? So that's the main idea behind Zerg. We want to be always producing, always spending the larva that we have, because right when that larva appears, it can immediately turn into something that immediately starts doing things. So it's either attacking or it's mining minerals and gaining you that economic lead. So spending larva immediately is incredibly important. So another thing that we may want to watch when watching games is this tab here. Is there constantly an adept in production? Is there constantly something else in production? Stalkers, something like that. That's very important to watch that. Now, finally, the last point I want to make is about the selection tab down here. This is a good way to watch production if you're watching Terran production or you're watching Protoss production. Are these buildings constantly on cooldown? We want to be watching that. In the case that a Terran, so we can check each individual building just by clicking it and then checking on the right-hand side to see if that building's on cooldown. But always checking. Making sure that those buildings aren't off cooldown is really important. On a production facility like a Robo Bay, it would be important to check to see, is there a unit queued? And then on top of that, right when that unit is about to finish, is there another unit queued right after it? You never really want to have more. You never really want to have more than 2 units queued at any time, because if you have more than 2 units queued, basically what that means is that the third unit in the queue is just money you could have been spending right now on something else, but instead you've just invested it long term in making it immortal, so you don't have to think about making that immortal right now. Or you've invested it long term in making the 5th Marine, but you could be building an extra racks so that you don't have to have as many units queued. So that's the main function of using this selection bar. It's not great for gateways just because you can't see the cooldown like you can in game, but you can click on each gateway and check, is that gateway actually producing anything? Is it on cooldown? You want it to always be on cooldown, not ready to warp in, because if it's always on cooldown, that means you have the most possible units. For Terran, you want to just check, is there always a Marine in production in each production facility? Is there always something in production on my factory? Is there always something in production on my starport? So thanks for watching, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it was helpful for you. I hope you learned a little bit about macro and how it works and how you can analyze your own macro play and then build some triggers to say, hey, when I get my second queen, I need to make a creep tumor, because otherwise I'll float too much larva and not be able to spend it. Or, whenever I get attacked, I really need to think, build probes, because I always miss probes when I'm being attacked. So those are key things. Go into your games, analyze, find trends, and then when you find a trend, build a trigger into your mindset so that you know and you remember what you need to remember in those situations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.